Numisma Talks. Every second and fourth Thursday of the month at noon Mountain, we will be here with a new presentation. During this presentation, you may come up with questions, and if you do, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send in your question, as all of you are muted on this presentation. Your question will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Now, I would like to introduce you to today's presenter, Douglas Mudd. Doug is the Curator Director of the American Numismatic Association's Edward C. Rochette Money Museum in Colorado Springs, Colorado. He is responsible for developing, planning, and content of the museum's exhibition program and the organization and care of the A&A collections. He has created dozens of numismatic exhibits for the museum and for the A&A semi-annual conventions. His recent work has expanded the museum's exhibits into the virtual world. Let me try that again. Doug will be presenting medieval European coinage, and it's all yours, Doug.
Thanks, Paula. So today we're going to go on a jaunt through the early medieval world, and I will share the screen. So we'll be talking about the money of the early Roman Empire and, well, the end of the Roman Empire, the early medieval period. So I'll be talking about the coinage of Europe in the wake of the fall of the Western Roman Empire. This is about the first half of the Middle Ages, from the traditional date of the fall of Rome in 476 AD to the beginning of the Carolingian Empire during the 9th century. And we'll start out with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the late 5th century AD. We're going to talk a little bit about the background history, and then we'll get into the coins for the next third of the talk. So Western and Central Europe were plunged into the so-called Dark Ages at the end of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire. The economy collapsed and cities and towns shrank or disappeared altogether. Long-distance trade and a sophisticated monetized economy were replaced by barter and agricultural subsistence. These changes are reflected in the coinage. The overall impression left by the coinage is of economic contraction, as the unity of the Roman Empire and its institutions was replaced by a chaotic patchwork of barbarian kingdoms, leftover domains of powerful Roman landlords, and simple anarchy. Money became scarce and was increasingly limited to one of two denominations in gold, except for Italy, where a monetized economy survived, in part due to the proximity of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Roman Empire in the late 4th century was divided into the Western and Eastern empires. So this gives you a little bit of the background of what was going on. Over the course of the 5th century, both empires suffered from civil wars as well as a series of external invasions. The Roman economy and society began to break down as life became more difficult and the needs of the army became harder to meet. Society was already stressed, so much so that prices and jobs had been fixed at the end of the 3rd century by Diocletian in order to preserve order in the face of increasing social and economic chaos. If you were a baker, for example, you couldn't change your profession. You and your sons had to follow in your footsteps for the foreseeable future, and prices were fixed. Of course, this never works in real life, and there was a lively black market, and one of the things that actually occurred in many of the cities was people in undesirable professions would try to escape, or people who didn't, a baker who didn't want to, who was the son of a baker might not want to be a baker, and they would run off. And the authorities had the ability to actually chase them down and force them to do the work. So it was an interesting time. Things were falling apart very quickly. The standard of living was falling and taxes were high, mainly to support the army. The army itself was increasingly made up of barbarians, often relatives of those they were supposed to fight. So you can imagine what kinds of problems that might have, but basically ensured a dangerous alienation between the Roman Empire and the citizens it was supposed to protect. Now, the Eastern Roman Empire had always been the wealthier part of the empire, so it was in slightly better shape, but both were under serious pressure. The late Roman Empire had a fully monetized economy in which most economic transactions were conducted with coinage. The monetary system had been simplified from the earlier empire, largely due to the increasing shortage of silver, but it was still based on coinage in three metals: gold, silver, increasingly debased, often basically a silver wash over a bronze core, and bronze. Silver and bronze coins were the basis for local trade and everyday transactions, and were subject to frequent changes in weight and size during the 4th and 5th centuries, so much so that we're not even sure today which denominations correspond to the coins that are mentioned in the texts. Different familiar old coins were reduced in size to the point where they're practically specks of metal, like the numi or the numis, which became something from about a nickel in size down to uh, about half the size of a dime and even smaller. The monetary system was sharply divided between that used for international trade and large payments that were used in the local economies. Gold gold was based on the solidus and its fractions, which remained remarkably consistent in weight and purity, in large part because these coins were the backbone of long distance trade and long distance and foreign trade. These pieces were also the preferred medium for paying off barbarians set on invading the empire, and for that reason they became the coinage with which the barbarians were most familiar, and the basis for their own early non-monetary but uh, basically honorary systems. So you can see the different coins here: the gold solidus, the trimissus, which is a third of a solidus. There was also uh, a semisis, which is half of the solidus, and the silver siliqua and the bronze AE, just a bronze coin. The barbarian invasions. A decisive turning point came in 406 AD when the Rhine River, the boundary between the German barbarians and the Western Roman Empire, froze over, leaving the western provinces unprotected as Germanic tribes crossed into the empire en masse. There was nothing the Roman authorities could do to prevent the occupation of large parts of northern Gaul. Now, this was unusual in that the Rhine normally did not freeze completely over, certainly not solid enough where it would be easy to cross over for a week or more. And this allowed huge new tribes that had not been given permission to come over by the Romans to come over. It's interesting because there are actually some letters that survive. One was especially poignant. Basically, a garrison commander along the Rhine writing to Rome asking if reinforcements were going to be coming. You can just imagine the isolation, because the crossings were not made all along the Rhine. They were made at certain points, the easiest points to cross. So different garrisons would be left isolated, trying to figure out what to do next. As barbarians were invited into or invaded the empire, they brought their own customs and way of life. The local economy reverted to mostly subsistence agriculture, often resulting in the disappearance of coinage as cities and towns withered and an economy based on barter became the rule of the day. Coinage was limited to ceremonial gift exchanges and for use in jewelry. Once the gates were open, there was no way to get rid of the barbarians. Roman control gradually slipped away from many provinces until the central government controlled little more than Italy south of the Alps. All of Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania were occupied by barbarians and divided into tribal areas. Roman local government survived in some areas, but only for a while. We know of different powerful landlords that uh, by this time had raised their own troops or took over the local Roman garrisons and tried to protect small regions, small areas, basically counties and things like that. Um, but it gives a an impression of chaos with sort of hopeless holdouts trying to prevent the collapse of the world as they knew it. In 476 AD, the Romanized general Odovaker deposed Romulus Augustus ending the line of Western Roman emperors, leaving the Western Empire outside of Italy in chaos. Changes were not immediate, nor were they consistent everywhere. Some places were left relatively unscathed, while others were virtually destroyed. Britain, after the last Roman garrison left in the early 5th century, gradually sank into anarchy as various barbarians from the north, west, and east invaded and eventually settled, creating a new society over the course of the 5th through 8th centuries. The most common type for the early barbarian coinage was the gold tremisus. King Odovaker in Italy set the tone with the issue of coinage that closely imitated Roman types, including the reigning emperor's name, in this case, Emperor Zeno. That's the Eastern Roman Empire's emperor. The use of Roman types for coinage helped to legitimize local rulers, suggesting that they had the recognition and respect of the Eastern Roman Emperor. Whether or not they did, it gave some legitimacy to the coinage that they were trying to use. And you can see different examples. So here's a gold solidus of Odovaker, a gold tremisus, and then the tiny silver half siliqua. Outside of Italy, where more damage had been done to the Roman infrastructure, coinage survived in simplified form. The new kings and warlords issued coins in the name of the reigning Eastern emperors to maintain the illusion of legitimacy, but the coins increasingly fell away from the imperial standards of art and quality control and weight. Over time, the names of local kings were introduced in place of Roman emperors. As the economy reverted to subsistence levels, cities became towns, and towns became villages or disappeared altogether. And coinage became mostly unnecessary except for large transactions involving imported luxuries for the new warrior elites. And we have examples of things like wine being imported from the Eastern Empire or other areas, and those things almost certainly had to be paid in the form of money. So you get an idea of the variety here, the gold solidi and the tremises or tremisi, and the change in the designs from very Roman appearing coin on the left to very rough pieces, but they have the general idea. You can see where they're getting the basic design from. So the Germanic kingdoms. So these kingdoms, we can locate them generally, but it's hard to give a solid border to them because they changed frequently. The borders were pretty fluid. By the mid-6th century, the initial barbarian invaders had begun to settle down to form recognizable kingdoms, which can be located by the find sites of their coinage and some other cultural types of indicators that help to figure out who is who. The surviving Eastern Empire had also recovered enough to try to reconquer the Western provinces. The Eastern Emperor Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565, reclaimed parts of the Western Empire, but nothing could restore the empire as it had been. In the process, Italy became a battleground for decades, destroying the peace and prosperity that the Ostrogothic kingdom had brought and ruining the relative unity it enjoyed since the fall of the Western Empire in the previous century. Now we'll move on to the coins and talk a little bit more about them in detail. As I go through this, you'll notice the dates bounce around a lot because I'm going to be talking about each tribal group, and they came in at different times and did different things in relation to each other, but also in a separate timeline. So we'll be jumping around in time a little here. When Odovaker, one of Rome's Germanic generals, or Magister Militum as the title was, deposed Romulus Augustus, he did little to disrupt the existing social and economic system. Basically, it was working, and as long as he got paid, he was not interested in changing the system. He just wanted to be in charge. So Italy managed to avoid the devastation suffered by the other provinces. In 487, Emperor Zeno authorized Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths, to conquer and occupy Italy as the new home of his people, which he was able to do with little damage to the infrastructure again. For Zeno, this solved two problems. He got the Ostrogoths out of the Eastern Roman Empire, and he removed a powerful potential enemy. The Ostrogoths ruled an undivided Italy for the next 40 years until they were defeated by Justinian's general Belisarius in 538. Ironically, Justinian's reconquest, i.e., bringing back Roman civilization, was never completed and took place over decades, which meant that it caused huge damage to the Italian infrastructure and finally pushed it into the Dark Ages along with the rest of Western Europe. Couldn't have made him very popular with the people that lived there at the time. The Visigoths first invaded the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD. They defeated the Emperor Valens at Adrianople in 378 and sacked Rome under Alaric in 410. Alaric's successor, Atholf, led the Visigoths into Gaul and Spain, where they fought against the Vandals and Suevi as allies of the Emperor Honorius. Honorius rewarded them in 417 with Western Aquitaine as federati. Federati was the Roman word for allies or military allies. So you've got situations where the empire is falling apart and Roman emperors are actively using one group of Germans against another group of Germans, and then paying them with the parts of the empire that they'd already lost control of. So it was no big deal for them, but it allowed them to at least divert the tribes from coming at Rome itself. The Visigoths served the empire as allies until King Euric established an independent kingdom in the mid-5th century. The Franks under Clovis crushed the Visigothic kingdom in 507, forcing the Visigoths into Spain. King Leovigild, who ruled from 568 to 586, established a permanent kingdom in Spain that was to last until the Arab conquest in 711 AD. The Visigothic kingdom suffered from constant infighting among its rulers, resulting in an ever-changing number of kingdoms and sub-kingdoms within the peninsula, and over 80 mints. So it makes it a great field for collecting, but also very confusing and indicates the kingdom was pretty weak because Visigothic Spain fell fairly quickly to the Arab conquest when they came across the Straits of Gibraltar in 711 to 715 AD. And you can see the coins, some of them are quite attractive, and all of them are legible so that you can actually figure out who the kings were. Sometimes extra information as well. But you see they fall off in design quality and all that over time as well. Some of the later ones do become practically illegible unless you know what they're trying to say. On December 31st, 406, the Vandals crossed the frozen Rhine to invade Gaul, which they devastated. Under Gunderic, the Vandals plundered their way westward and southward through Aquitaine and by 409 had entered Spain, where they were granted land. In 429, the Vandal king Gaiseric was invited into the Roman province of North Africa by its governor, and by 439 he had moved his whole people and established a powerful new Vandal kingdom based in North Africa. So the Roman governor of North Africa called in the Vandals because he was unable to get support from Rome and the armies in Italy for his own problems with the Berbers and other peoples in North Africa. So he figured it was better to deal with a powerful Vandal king than the local bandits and peoples in North Africa. The Vandals' power was based on their fleet, which allowed them to raid throughout the Western Mediterranean, including sacking Rome in 455. So not a good thing for the Romans to have these barbarian kingdoms become more mobile and taking over Roman areas. The Vandal kingdom was destroyed by Justinian's general Belisarius in 534 as Justinian was trying to reestablish the empire in the west. North Africa fell fairly easily and remained relatively intact and continued to issue a range of coinage on the Roman model until the Roman reconquest. So you can see the coins they had. They retained a look very much like the Roman coins, just a little bit cruder, but uh, not as crude as the coins that you see in other areas that had been conquered by the Germans. And that's because they were invited in and did not have to actually destroy the infrastructure and kept the existing mints and, uh, in many cases, the officials as well. Now, the Franks were a different deal. They were originally a confederation of Germanic tribes that began to raid Roman territory as early as the 3rd century AD. The Franks also supplied many recruits to the Roman Empire, and during the 4th century and 5th century, uh, you had lots of Franks appearing in the Roman annals, as generals and as groups of mercenaries or groups of actual Roman soldiers. In 358, a Frankish tribe received permission from the Emperor Julian to settle on Roman territory as federati or as allies. As federati, the Franks were expected to assist the Roman Empire with troops in return for autonomy in the areas where they settled. So basically, they were creating enclaves of barbarian territory within the Roman Empire in exchange for getting uh, highly capable troops. The Franks were united as a single kingdom under the Merovingians, whose most famous king, Clovis, who ruled from 481 to 511, conquered all of Gaul and formed what would become the nucleus for the French kingdom. After Clovis, the kingdom was split between his sons, which was a typical thing to do. Basically, you would take your conquests and then divide them amongst your sons, who would often end up fighting, trying to rebuild the whole inheritance. So the kingdom that Clovis has established was divided and redivided for the next 2 centuries, though the idea of a unified Frankish kingdom never fully disappeared. And just to look at some of the coins, you can see how the coins develop very similar to the others. They start with a basic Byzantine sort of coinage and then devolve into a bust and then the cross from the later Byzantine or the early Byzantine coinage. Burgundians. The Burgundians were another Germanic tribe who formed a small kingdom under Roman authority around Geneva in the mid-5th century. As Roman power weakened, the Burgundians expanded their kingdom to include much of southeastern France, northern Italy, and parts of Switzerland. The Franks under Clovis conquered the Burgundian kingdom around 532 to 534, and they subsequently became an important vassal state of the Franks. Then we have the Lombards. So the Lombards originally settled in the Roman province of Pannonia in the Balkans in the early 5th century and began to invade Italy in 568. They quickly took control of the region from the Alps to the Po Valley, later known as Lombardy, understandably, and established their capital at Pavia in 571 under their king Alboin. With the exception of Luitprand, 712 to 744, the kings of Lombardy were basically pretty weak, and the kingdom was finally crushed by Charlemagne in 774. They suffered from the same problem that many of the Germanic kingdoms had of infighting amongst various chiefs, or when a central king became evident, their sons. The Lombards of Benevento survived under the dukes of Lombardy until the 11th century, despite the fall of the kingdom. So they maintained a presence for quite a long time, even though as a kingdom they weren't terribly successful. And you can see another set of standard looking coins. In this case, you're using facing busts, and they have the cross from the Byzantine coins, and the king has a cross on their crown or diadem, but they were still wearing the remains of a Roman toga, um, which is interesting to see how some of the fashions stay. Now, for almost 2 centuries following the end of the Roman rule in the early 5th century AD, Britain was virtually devoid of coins, though remnants of the Roman coinage and its imitations, known as barbarous radiates, continued to be used in isolated exchanges. Coins were reintroduced to Britain in the mid-6th century as trade between the Anglo-Saxons and the Merovingians grew. The British silver sceatta paralleled the Merovingian silver units in weight, size, and iconography. As the sceattas and their Merovingian counterparts were mostly devoid of legible legends, the iconography used on these coins is important for their identification. Coins became so widespread in Britain that over 100 individual types of sceattas have been identified from the 7th and 8th centuries. Some of these coins are certainly royal issues, but the source for most of them is unknown, although many can be assigned to a particular region and time frame. We're just not sure who issued them and exactly where in some cases. Modern studies of sceattas have shown 3 phases of production: primary, intermediate, and secondary, which are further divided into series and then types within each series. The primary phase, circa 680 to 710, is comprised of the earliest series and are mostly located in southeast Britain and Northumbria. The intermediate phase, from circa 710 to 720, is characterized by a huge influx of foreign sceattas into Britain, mainly from places like Saxony, the coasts, Denmark, and the coastal areas of Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany. And this precipitated the vast amount of British coinage that was developed in the subsequent secondary phase, circa 710 to 760 AD. The sceatta remained the basic silver unit in the British monetary system until Offa's reform in the late 700s. Offa was a powerful king of the sorry about that, not the West Saxon or East Saxons, but the kingdom north of there. Sorry about that. Similar to the reform of the Merovingian king Pepin the Short in the 750s, these coins uh, developed in that same vein, where now they replace the early coins with the very earliest of the pennies. Sceattas remained in use in Northumbria until the kingdom was overrun by the Vikings in the late 9th century. But here, before we go on, you can see the coins developing from something that's looks like the small Roman coins of the time. You've got a head, and then you've got a standard on the reverse, to something that's much less Roman looking, where you have the head facing, but it doesn't look much like a human. It could be a monster of some sort. And then what could be a dragon, a horse, something on the reverse. And then a return to something that has a standard look to it, but it has, uh, you know, a, a very strange sort of, like the crest of a helmet, something hard to say what it is, on the obverse. Then we move on to the period of Frankish dominance, where we can see the map, how things are developing. The Frankish kingdom was revived in the mid-8th century by a series of warlike mayors of the palace, basically the major domo, who was effectively the person in charge, because the later Merovingian kings were uniformly very weak. Often they became kings very young and were under the control of the mayors of the palace, who were very careful to maintain their power. They became hereditary, which became more of a problem for the kings. So the kings became nothing but figureheads. The Frankish kingdom became the dominant force in Western Europe during this period, setting the stage for the emergence of a new royal dynasty. Over the course of the 8th century, the Germanic peoples uh, had settled down and integrated with the local populations. They had stopped having their tribal identities being different from the local peoples, and their names and the tribal names became associated with the provinces in which they had settled down. As a result, gold began to become scarcer as tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire disappeared because they were no longer traveling around sending war bands to raid the empire, and existing supplies were exhausted. At the same time, the Western European economy began to slowly recover, and new silver mines began to be exploited, resulting in the reintroduction of silver and a new coin, the penny, based on the old Roman denarius. The penny became the characteristic coin of medieval Europe outside of the Byzantine Empire and was to dominate Western European coinage for over 500 years. And here we have on the left the King Offa's penny, which he introduced as a standard coin, which became very common throughout the English islands and, I mean, Great Britain, the English kingdoms. And then you have the comparable coin of Carolingian France issued by Charlemagne. So these coins were based closely on the same standard originally, and then they fell off in the various kingdoms as uh, changes were made, as coins were debased or weights were lowered. The English tended to have a very standardized and stable system and became famous for it in the middle of the period of the Middle Ages. By the late 7th century, the Merovingians had sunk into impotence and most power was held by their chief officers. In 687, Pippin of Herstal, mayor of the Palace of Austrasia, one of several Frankish kingdoms of the time, became the sole governor of the entire Frankish kingdom. Pippin was succeeded by his son Charles Martel, the Hammer, who defeated the Arab invasion of France at the Battle of Tours in 737, thus basically stopping the advance of the Arabs and the new religion of Islam into Western Europe through Spain. After 737, Charles ruled the Franks without a Merovingian king, but refused to take the title himself. Charles was succeeded by his sons Carloman and Pippin the Short, the father of Charlemagne. To lend legitimacy to their rule, the brothers placed Childeric III on the throne, and he ended up being the last of the Merovingian kings. Pippin was succeeded by his son Charles the Great, Charlemagne, as he's known more commonly, as king in his own right in 768. And here you see a classic example of the silver penny or denier. Charlemagne is well known to anybody that has an interest in medieval European history as the founder of the Holy Roman Empire, or a revival of the Western Roman Empire, which became the Holy Roman Empire. He was the greatest ruler of the medieval period, and over the course of his long career, he created the most powerful kingdom to be seen in the West since the fall of the Western Roman Empire and set the foundations for the political, economic, social, and legal development of Europe for the next 1,000 years. In 800 AD, Charlemagne was crowned emperor of the newly revived Western Empire by Pope Leo III. This empire, in modified form, became the Holy Roman Empire and was to last in Germany and Central Europe until 1806. So this was a major event and basically signaled the end of what we might call the Dark Ages, even though it's not fashionable anymore, but the end of the struggle to survive the end of Western Roman civilization and the beginnings of the solid beginnings of a new civilization can be traced to this period. And you can see how the Carolingian Empire looked at the time. So he had reconquered over half of Italy, all of what became France, and then much of Germany up to the Rhine River, and going on into the Balkans, creating by far the largest kingdom that existed after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. At his death, the Frankish kingdom had expanded well into Central Europe and Italy, creating the most powerful single state in Western Europe, rivaling the power and unity of the Byzantine Empire of the time, and changing the course of Western European history. The political and economic stability of the Carolingian Empire created an economic and cultural revival, which unfortunately was cut short by the increasing incursions of the Vikings and the dynastic warfare of Charlemagne's descendants. He His kingdom was divided amongst his three sons, which basically created the nucleus for France, uh, Germany, and the what became the Netherlands, Belgium, and Burgundy, and the northern part, Burgundy, which included parts of Switzerland. Sustained recovery from the fall of the Roman Empire was not to start until the 11th century, a full 2 centuries later. And we'll finish with a discussion of the Vikings, who basically uh, created the instability which helped to weaken the Charlemagne's empire. So in 787, a new group of barbarians made themselves known to history for the first time, the Vikings. In 793, a group of Vikings from Norway attacked the Abbey of Lindisfarne, which was famous for its learned community of monks. It was one of the centers of education and knowledge in England, and they burned it to the ground. Soon, Vikings were raiding all along the coast of England, Ireland, France, and the Low Countries, inspiring terror and causing chaos wherever they sailed. The Vikings themselves were Scandinavians from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. They perfected new sailing ships and techniques that allowed them to sail the rough northern seas with relative safety, which they did, much to the dismay of the rest of Western Europe. Their raids changed the political and economic map of Europe, hastening the end of the Merovingian kingdom, permanently altering the course of Irish history, and heavily influencing the course of English and Scottish history. The Vikings were not only destructive raiders and pirates, however, they were also bold explorers, traders, and settlers, exploring and raiding from North America to the Caspian Sea, founding dynasties and kingdoms along the way, including Normandy and Russia, which would have a major part in the histories of the areas in which they were located, France and Eastern Europe, the borders of Asia, which would profoundly influence Eurasian history in the centuries to come. And with that, we will end our trip through the early medieval period, and I open the stage for questions.
Perfect. Would you like to stop sharing so we can just have...
Yeah, let me show the last two slides.
Oh, I'm
So
sorry.
there's references for medieval coinage here. There's a couple of good books that discuss the coins and show the different types of coins and some of the history behind them. And then there's some good websites. The classical numismatic group C&G is always a great place to go for looking at any coins from before the modern period, because they do have a record that goes back to about the early 2000s. So there's a lot of coins with great write-ups for many of them. And then there's a neat site on early medieval and medieval coins. plus the French and English royal and medieval coins. There's a site that covers that very nicely. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing right now and we'll get to the questions.
Okay. Um, First one, it says not a question, but really interesting information. And then, are the coins illustrated in this talk in the A&A collection? And are any on display in the museum?
Uh, uh, Not all of the coins are in the A&A collection. Some of them are actually from the C&G website, but we do have some medieval coins on display, including a nice little group of English uh, coins from Northumbria and the early period, not the sceattas, but the slightly afterwards. And then we have a couple of cases that show the progression of the medieval period, particularly the later period, the talk that follows this, where you have the high medieval period, as it's known.
Okay. How did the Vikings influence the use of coins? Did they mint coins? Did they prefer certain coins? Or did they use whatever they plundered?
All of the above. They did produce their own coins. They were on the model of uh, the current pennies that they found, but they also used coins from all different areas. And what's really interesting is that uh, under the Vikings, you had different emporiums, market towns that were created, such as Hedeby. And in Eastern Europe, there were several towns that were located along the river systems, like the Volga, um, and these towns would, where they've been dug, there's a lot of variety in the coinage. In particular, you see the Abbasid and even Umayyad coins so Arab Islamic coins that were either paid to the Vikings or are captured in raids, ending up as far north as Hedeby, into Scandinavia itself, and actually going west as far as there are a few that are found as far west as um, Ireland.
Hmm.
So these coins, they used whatever they found. They made their own coinage, but as long as the coins were good gold and silver, they would use them in trade. Um, so all of those
Yeah.
suggestions that you had as far as different ways that they would use them.
Hey, that was awesome. You're so interesting and knowledgeable. Take that as a
Thank
pat on
you,
the
Tracy.
back. Um, you mentioned that silver and bronze coins were used for trade. What were gold coins used for?
Silver and bronze coins were used for local trade. I think I misspoke on that. The the gold was what was used for international trade largely. Silver had mostly run out of the late Roman period because silver had been heavily mined before then and used for the standard, denarius and other silver coins in the earlier period. But by the 500s, silver was becoming relatively rare. A lot of the mines had run out, and it had all been sent to the east, basically, for the Silk Road trade system. Um, However, new mines started to be opened a little bit later on, and you see a little bit of a revival of silver towards the end of this period. By the 1400s, new mining techniques allowed silver mines that had been closed for centuries to be reopened. And then, of course, the discovery of the New World and the vast amounts of silver and gold that came from that changed things utterly.
Okay. I'd be very interested in learning resources on the emergence of Scandinavian coinage.
Yeah, I don't have the names of the books at the top of my head, but there have been some really good um, documentaries recently, plus a couple of books that discuss the what they've been finding over the last basically 30 to 40 years
Hmm.
Particularly, I mean, Hedeby and the Scandinavian areas are a little bit better known and better published, but there's been new information that's been coming out from them. In particular, there's information that's coming out about the Eastern Vikings
Hmm.
and how they influenced trade that is totally new as far as the standard works of history on the subject. Plus, they have a heavy. There's a couple of books that really talk about the coinage and how diverse it was and where it was coming from. I I apologize. I don't have a list of those books, but there's about three or four that really form the foundation for new knowledge on that subject.
Okay. Again, not a question. I am having some serious flashbacks to my high school world history class that I was too young to appreciate. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. My older, wiser self very much appreciates it. Thanks, Diane.
Thank you.
Um, yeah. I have a nice group of very thin silver coins. How were these used?
So the very thin silver coins are basically they're probably pennies, or perhaps if they're a little bit later, the half pennies. It depends on the period, but basically what happened once the coinage revived, they were using Islamic coinage as a model as far as they saw these coins. And so instead of the old Roman thick coins with very high relief, they were using coins that are much flatter. A, they were easier to strike and make the dies for, but B, it was the fashion of the time. Um, so you would see these coins circulating all over Europe and in the East, going into the Byzantine Empire, but also the Islamic Empire. They were brought in through Spain. They were brought in from the East through the Balkans,
Mhm.
and that became the style. In part, it's because of what happened with the Sasanians when they took the old Roman coins and basically, instead of melting the coins down, they would smash them into a thinner planchet and then use those as the basis for their coins, and that essentially changed the style permanently.
Hmm. Doug, this is from Michael Shutterly. One of the
Yep.
best general discussions of the Viking and North Sea coinages is Coinage and History in the North Sea World, circa 500 to 1250, edited by Barry Cook and Gareth Williams. There's also Silver Economy in the Viking Age by James Graham Campbell and Gareth Williams.
Yes, thank you. I was aware of the second book. I haven't seen the first one, or I haven't read it. But thank you very much, Mike. I didn't have that at the top of my tip of my tongue. So
That's okay.
thank you.
You're not expected to know everything, Doug. Why are some of these coins so tiny?
Well, one of the things that happened over time was that as the economy started to falter, the Roman government, for example, would start to cut back on the amount of bronze or silver in the coins, and uh, that meant that a coin that previously might have been a nickel in size would get smaller and smaller, and it was just a reflection of, hey, we need to pay the troops or we need to buy supplies, and we're in charge. We can force people to take this coin as instead of to use modern denominations, instead of being a nickel size, it's a dime, but we're going to call it not a dime. Sorry, it's a it's a penny size, but we're going to call it a nickel and force people to take it. It whenever that happens, you know that the economy is starting to fall apart and the government is trying to save money and is no longer very interested in what the people have to say about it. And realistically, they didn't have a choice, so they took what was given and they used it as money.
Okay. Are you planning to publish your talk in a manuscript someday?
I have no plans to do so, but this is being recorded, so it'll
Yeah.
be online for a while. I do hope to write whenever I decide to retire some more, so I might cover some of these issues because I find the history of money and how it develops in different areas at different times fascinating. So I always try to figure out why people did the things they did and what it ended up looking like.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions for now. I'm going to do my wrap up and then I'll make sure we haven't missed any. But I want to thank everyone for joining us and thank you, Doug, for a great presentation. Our Numisma Talks are being recorded, as Doug said, and are available to everyone at our new e-learning academy on money.org/education. Please be sure to check for future programs and see what's coming up. Another thank you and a well done before we say goodbye. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.